Coming up on tonight's This Week in Politics.
The United States will respond in a robust and meaningful way when the Russian government engages in harmful activities. We've already demonstrated that.
President Biden putting Russia on notice that cyber attacks coming from the country will not be tolerated, as more in Washington now urge a call to action. Also, there is a growing disagreement on what kind of policy is needed to protect the voting rights of Americans, specifically minority voters.
We're going to continue to press for federal action, to move forward on a bill that the president would love to sign into law.
And infrastructure talks stall as Republican negotiators and the White House reach an impasse on what exactly to do and how much it should cost.
But an agreement requires that actually each side is willing to give up some of what it wants. And as we learned yesterday, President Biden is unwilling to let go of some of the most radical promises he made to the left wing of his party.
We are going to cover a lot of ground tonight. Good evening, everyone. I'm Brian Allen. We're going to begin with cyber attacks against America. In recent weeks, we've told you about attacks targeting the Colonial Pipeline out east and on North American and Australian facilities belonging to meatpacker JBS, which affected the company's manufacturing plants, including one in Worthington. Just this week, hackers attacked the computer network of the Des Moines Area Community College in Iowa. DMAC operates 6 campuses, the FBI now assisting in that investigation. On Capitol Hill this week, Attorney General Merrick Garland urging caution about the future of such cyber attacks.
This is a very, very serious threat. We saw what can happen with respect to a pipeline, with respect to a food processing company. You can imagine what could happen if we had multiple attacks at the same time on even more fundamental infrastructure.
Garland is backing a budget increase request from the Biden administration to spend more money on preventing cyber attacks. In fact, this during a meeting of the Senate Committee on Homeland Security. Congressional computer networks were attacked by hackers. Here's Ohio Republican Senator Rob Portman.
Just this morning, news broke that a constituent outreach services platform that nearly 60 offices in the United States Congress, the House of Representatives, uses was hit with a ransomware attack. As I've said before, no one is safe from these attacks, including us.
Switching gears now, the latest drought monitor showing over 95% of South Dakota is in at least an abnormally dry condition. And that's a real concern for farmers and producers as they look for relief soon before it gets too late into the growing season. Representative Dusty Johnson hosted a roundtable discussion with the South Dakota Corn Association and the South Dakota Soybean Association. While different topics from access to markets in other countries and taxes came up, the biggest talking point by far was the drought and what to expect moving forward.
You know, we were dry before planting. After planting, we got a little shot here in our area of rain, but it's getting dry again, and it's going to be hot for the next 10 to 12 days. We're hoping that our genetics are good enough to withstand some drought, but we definitely need some rain here.
Farmer Jordan Scott says situations like this are why farmers and producers get crop insurance, and while he says no one wants to have to fall back on it, it is a safety net should the summer continue like this. The next generation of stealth bomber will be based out of western South Dakota. The Air Force says the B-21 bomber will be coming to Ellsworth Air Force Base. Both Senators John Thune and Mike Rounds were heavily involved in the process. Senator Thune tells us this development is an example of how far Ellsworth has come in the last decade and a half.
It's incredibly exciting news. It's a once-in-a-generation historic opportunity for South Dakota. And obviously, from where we've come from, when we've gone from, in 2005, BRAC to the B-21, it's an amazing story. And I'm very humbled to have been a part of it.
It may be several years before the B-21 is in active use, but Senator Thune tells us he believes the economic effect of this decision will be felt at Ellsworth and surrounding areas soon. When This Week in Politics continues here on KSFY, debating voting rights in Washington. Will any type of new measure be approved, or will it get mired down in partisan disagreements? And the clock is on for medical marijuana in South Dakota. And welcome back to This Week in Politics here on KSFY.
There's no threat to the voting rights law. It's against the law to discriminate in voting on the basis of race already, and so I think it's unnecessary.
Senate Minority Leader Republican Mitch McConnell saying the existing 1965 Voting Rights Act protects minority voters' rights and that new legislation may not be necessary. There are currently two measures being discussed in Washington that would protect and enhance the voting rights of all Americans. The For the People Act, which would revise rules for voting, campaign finance, and ethics in campaigning, and the John Lewis Voting Rights Act, which would mandate that any state changes to election law be cleared by the federal government first. All of this happens as states such as Georgia, Texas, and Florida, all Republican-controlled, work to enact new election requirements, such as shortening the window for early voting, reducing the number of voting locations, and limiting the ability to vote by mail, changes that are seen by many as targeting poor and minority voters, which tend to vote for Democrats. Here's Minnesota Senator Amy Klobuchar, who says these new state laws need to be balanced with some type of federal legislation.
And you know what political parties do when they lose an election? Usually, our party, the Republican Party in the past, when they lose an election, they say, okay, what did we do wrong? How do we change our policies? How do we change how we reach out to voters? How do we change our candidates? That's what they do. That's how you adjust. That's what a democracy is about. Do you know what these guys are doing right now? They're saying, how do we change our voters? How do we stop people from voting in this country? And it is wrong.
There is, as you might imagine, a party line split in Congress when it comes to new voting rights legislation, with Republicans generally opposing it, Democrats generally supporting it. That does not hold true for Democratic Senator Joe Manchin of West Virginia, who met with NAACP leaders this week but would not commit to them that he would support any new voting rights legislation.
What we had was we had a respectful, we had a very informative, and it was a very good conversation that we had, and as a starting of a good relationship. It really was.
So are you open to supporting this legislation?
I can just tell you, it was a great, informative, talented group of people that were very respectful.
And that response from Manchin led to this response from New York Democratic Congressman Jamal Bowman.
Joe Manchin has become the new Mitch McConnell. Mitch McConnell, during Obama's presidency, said he would do everything in his power to stop Obama. He's also repeated that now during the Biden presidency by saying he would do everything in his power to stop President Biden. And now Joe Manchin is doing everything in his power to stop democracy and to stop our work for the people, the work that the people sent us here to do.
And watching all of this unfold, Bernice King, the daughter of slain civil rights leader Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.
I'm here because there's a major assault on the crown of my father's work, the Voting Rights Act. Yeah. And I'm here because justice is still lying prostrate on the floor of too many state houses across this country and on the floor of our U.S. Senate. And we must resuscitate it through the power of love.
Turning now to medical marijuana in South Dakota. It is set to become legal in the state in 18 days. South Dakota lawmakers have rejected rules proposed by Governor Noem's administration that would have set parameters for students who need to use medical marijuana at school. A legislative committee sent the rules back to the Department of Education for revision. Lawmakers complained the rules would have required access to medical pot in private schools and did not spell out what activities students would be barred from while using marijuana. While voters passed a law that requires state agencies to roll out a medical pot program this year, progress, as you know, has been slow going. Governor Noem is tasked with overseeing the program rollout. While medical marijuana is set to become legal in South Dakota on July 1, it will likely be months until the program is set up to implement the drug. Many cities are still working to outline how they'll manage medical marijuana in their own city limits. The first reading of a pause ordinance for medical marijuana was presented to the Sioux Falls City Council this week. That ordinance addresses the license and permits needed to operate a medical cannabis establishment. The ordinance aims to put a temporary pause on anyone being allowed to apply for a permit or license until the South Dakota Department of Health comes up with regulations. This means the city would be allowed to refuse applications on July 1st until the state officially has those rules in place, which would likely be this fall, but must be by October 29th. In the meantime, the city would be working on writing regulations for these establishments in anticipation of the state's rules.
It's really important that we get this pause in effect because we don't even know what we're approving at this point. And people who want to start a business need to make business decisions and they need to know what playbook they're going by. And so it would be premature for us to approve any licenses or permits to start construction on any buildings until we know what the rules are.
The City Council voting 5-2 to approve a second reading of this ordinance, and that is set to happen this coming Tuesday. Still to come on tonight's This Week in Politics, formal negotiations stall on a new infrastructure package in Washington. And Senator Thune reacts to a Senate committee report on the January 6th riot at the United States Capitol. Welcome back to This Week in Politics here on KSFY.
I mean, obviously, I was negotiating in good faith with the president, as he was with me, and when other things, other ideas come up, I'm for all ideas, but when other ideas come up that are presented to be, bigger and better, that had an effect, I think, on our negotiations.
The chief Republican infrastructure negotiator, expressing frustration after negotiations with the White House broke down this week over the price and the scope of the Biden administration's $1.7 trillion infrastructure plan. On the floor of the United States Senate, party leaders expressed their frustration.
Infrastructure investments have historically featured overwhelming bipartisan consensus. But an agreement requires that actually each side is willing to give up some of what it wants.
And it may well be that part of the bill that'll pass will be bipartisan and part of it will be through reconciliation. But we're not going to sacrifice the bigness and boldness in this bill.
10 senators, 5 from each party, announced a broad infrastructure agreement on Thursday. It is an 8-year, $1.2 trillion plan with no tax increases. However, a number of members of the Senate Democratic caucus have threatened to oppose it. Criticism has grown louder, underscoring the growing tension within the ranks as moderates urge their colleagues to show patience and Democratic leaders struggle to find a deal that can pass the 50-50 Senate. This week, the Senate released a bipartisan report in response to the January 6th insurrection at the U.S. Capitol. That document calling the lack of preparation by law enforcement a security collapse. According to that report, multiple agencies had intelligence on what Trump supporters were planning, including the FBI and the Department of Homeland Security. But they apparently failed to issue threat assessments or intelligence bulletins. U.S. Capitol Police also learned that rioters were discussing ways to invade tunnels around the complex and target Democratic members of Congress.
In the coming days, after a thorough review of the 100-page report, I will discuss its recommendations with my colleagues and work to institute reforms that will make a meaningful change to better protect the United States Capitol.
Of note here, that report does not look into whether former President Trump played a role in inciting the attack. Federal prosecutors now say they expect to charge at least 550 people in that riot. 490 we know have already been charged. And that is This Week in Politics for this Sunday night. I'm Brian Allen. Please join us again next Sunday night at 10:30. And as always, from all of us to all of you, good night now from Courthouse Square.